On 8-bit machines, porting games isn't as straightforward as it is on modern hardware. Different ports of the same game could be entirely different experiences depending on the limitations of the hardware it's being played on. A prime example of this, and one of my favorite games of all time, is Sega's arcade classic, Outrun. Outrun was one of the flagship titles for Sega's Super Scaler arcade boards, and took advantage of the feature the system was named after, its clean scaling effect that gives an incredible sense of depth and speed. But the visuals alone are only half of the experience, as the real machine features a cabinet that shifts and turns as you make those hairpin turns throughout your run. Of course, with such a popular arcade release, home console ports were inevitable. The Sega Master System port is obviously quite limited, but it was one of the first to come out. As such, it's definitely stripped down when compared to the arcade, but the port makes use of the SMS's raster interrupt effects to create believable turns along the road, and also takes advantage of one of my favorite features of the Master System, or at least the Japanese Mark III, and that's the FM sound unit. The soundtrack can be listened to in both PSG chiptune style or FM synths. The Genesis/Mega Drive port upgrades the visuals from the 8-bit version and even throws in some new features that weren't in the arcade original, like a new song, as well as bonus visuals on the third stage if you manage to get through without crashing. And of course, the Saturn version comes closest to the original with its support for the Saturn steering wheel peripheral and beautiful graphics and sense of speed. Outrun is a great example of developers working within constraints to craft an experience unique to the target hardware. And these days, with all hardware being basically just a PC at this point, it isn't something we see very often. So I wanted to give this kind of hardware-specific porting process a shot myself. In 2024, I released a game for the Sega Master System called Space Tonbow. It was very specifically designed with the Sega Master System in mind. As a solo dev, I wasn't able to create a giant sprawling world to explore, but in my humble arcade-style action game, I made sure to take advantage of what the SMS had to offer, including the FM expansion and giving the system its first game to support Tate mode, a mode in which users can literally flip their CRT on its side to play in a vertical orientation. If you've got a CRT, this is 100% the way to play, by the way. Download link in the description. I ended up creating something tailored for the Master System hardware, but I was curious about other systems as well and wanted to explore other limited environments. I decided on the Sega Game Gear and the Pico 8. The Game Gear shares almost identical hardware with the Master System and therefore was a no-brainer, and the Pico 8 is a more modern yet still strictly limited environment that offers many modern quality of life improvements over real 8-bit systems. The port to the Game Gear was mostly straightforward. The Game Gear is practically just a portable Master System with only a couple of key differences that affected the porting process, those being the smaller screen resolution and the higher bit depth for color. But because the Game Gear is a portable system, I thought the Tate mode wouldn't be worth porting over, so I had ended up cutting it. The FM soundtrack is actually still in the game, but unless you can hook up your Game Gear to an FM expansion, then you won't be able to access it either. Because of the difference in screen size, I ended up having to redraw the character and enemy graphics so they would feel more at home on the smaller display. I took the opportunity to try and improve on the designs as well, taking advantage of the thousands of colors offered by the Game Gear as opposed to the 64 the Master System let me play with. This extended to the high score text as well as the title screen. Because the internals of the two Sega 8-bit systems are so similar, I didn't end up having to alter all that much code to get the game running. The biggest changes were to the locations of everything on the screen. Because the playfield is so much smaller, everything had to be moved in, and the spawn logic for enemies had to be slightly reworked to keep them from spawning off-screen. By far, the biggest work was done on the fade logic, though. The Master System holds its color in a single byte, where 6 bits are assigned for red, green, and blue. But the Game Gear uses 2 bytes, where each color gets 4 bits. So my fade logic, which only relied on changing data for a single byte, now needed to be adjusted for 2 bytes. I also took the opportunity to add more transition phases between the full brightness and full black due to the higher number of colors, resulting in a fade that is much more buttery and delicious than the original. Just look at that. Mwah! The final result is Space Tonbow with some prettier graphics on the Game Gear. To be honest, I didn't have much of a plan for the Game Gear port. I just woke up one Saturday morning and decided that I wanted to finish the port by the end of the weekend, and I'm really proud of how it turned out. The other port that I made was for the Pico 8. If you don't know what the Pico 8 is, it's a fantasy console with strict limitations built into it to make it feel more like an 8-bit system. You can run it on your PC or in browser. It's also the system that the original version of Celeste was made for. While it certainly harkens back to 8-bit systems of the 1980s, the Pico 8 is a different beast entirely from Sega's 8-bit systems. It's got different graphical limitations, a different screen size, a different sound engine, it even runs an entirely different programming language. So for this port, I started from the ground up. That different programming language it uses is called Lua, which compared to assembly, might as well be English. The only downside is that Lua indexes from 1 instead of 0, which is like the worst. But aside from that, it's super easy to learn and implement, and I had experience with it from writing graphic export scripts for Aseprite. For the graphics, I was able to share a lot of assets with the Game Gear version because although the Pico 8 has a smaller screen resolution, it's similar enough that the 16x16 size characters wouldn't be an issue. The most major difference for the Pico 8 is the color palette. Gone is the RGB index color of Sega's systems, and in its place is a hand-selected arrangement of 16 colors and 16 hidden colors to pick from. For graphics, this was a simple exercise in color swapping to see what worked best, but my beautiful bit manipulation fade routines from assembly had to be swapped out with a color table I made by eyeballing which colors looked darker than others. As a man of math before art, this was a sad fade routine for me, but the results speak for themselves, I think. Not too shabby. The original Master System version was played horizontally by default, but could be played vertically in Tate mode, which, for me, was always the intended way to play the game, and so the Pico 8 would follow in suit with vertical-oriented gameplay. Space Tonbow is hardly a complicated game. The real challenge of making the original was doing it in assembly, so with Lua at my disposal, I was able to quickly get an approximation of the original up and running. Since progress was fast, I decided to add 2 new features. The first was a new enemy type, just a simple reskin of the Kaikuro enemy, but one that moves slower and with a sinusoidal pattern, because humans hate sine waves.
Oh my god, you're killing this.
No, I'm not, I'm dead.
The second was in response to an issue with the original game. I noticed players would camp at the corners of the screen and just continuously dash into enemies and back up. So to try and remove this exploit, I decided to put asteroids on the side of the screen to discourage that kind of tactic. In hindsight, I think there are better solutions that complement Space Tombow's gameplay style better, but I'll save those for a future port perhaps. The music was the last thing I implemented in the Pico 8 version. Maybe I'm just used to Sega's 8-bit sound hardware, but I have to say that I wasn't a big fan of the instrument selection for the Pico 8. I'm by no means a musician, but I felt a lot of the sounds were scratchy or unpleasant. I was able to faithfully recreate the feeling of the 8-bit originals in the end, but it was a bit of an arduous process, to be honest. Here are some quick comparisons. For my first Pico 8 game, I think this version of Space Tonbow certainly isn't bad. I mean, I was just proud to actually finish it. Although I based it off the 8-bit original and often referenced the source code, there is still something missing from the Pico 8 version that I have a hard time putting my finger on. Maybe it's the drop from 60 to 30 FPS? Maybe it's the CRT filtering my experience? To me, the Pico 8 version feels like it has less soul than its 8-bit counterparts, if that means anything to you. It's tough to put into words. It's really something you have to experience to understand, I think. Download links are in the description if you want to check any of these games out for yourself, by the way. One thing I can say for sure is that knowing your hardware and having to work within strict limitations makes for a much more intimate experience with your game. There's something so viscerally satisfying about working with the bare metal and getting it to bend to your will that you don't get with languages outside of assembly. From here on, I plan to work on more games in assembly, as well as tools for anyone wanting to get into assembly development, and I'll be posting my progress on my Patreon page. I'm Bofner, and thanks for watching. See ya!